So let's begin this experiment. Before you start, make sure you're wearing your safety goggles, lab coat if you have some, or old clothing, some gloves so that you don't handle these particular items with your fingers. The oil in your fingers can actually cause some of the mass to fluctuate. Before we start, make sure you take your digital scale and calibrate it. In order to calibrate this particular digital scale, what you will need to do is turn it on. Make sure it's on for about 30 seconds. Find your weight that you're going to use to calibrate the scale. In this particular case, it's a 100-gram weight. Next, you're going to add the 100-gram weight to the scale, and then you're going to depress tare for 5 seconds, at which time it should go blank, and then it should read 100.0. You depress the tare button and your scale is now properly calibrated. It should read 100 grams. I can take my mass now, my weight, put it back in the box, as well as these other items, put it away, and I can begin my experiment. The first thing that you need to do in this particular experiment is to get a baggie that contains a nut and bolt and find the nut. In this particular case, looks like this, and then place it on your digital scale. Make sure you tare it so that the scale reads 0. And then place it on your digital scale, record the mass on your lab journal, and then remove it. Next, you want to weigh the bolt. Make sure you tare the scale again. Place the bolt on the scale. Let the scale settle down, and then read the mass of the bolt. When you are done, remove the bolt, put it back in its container with the nut, and then seal it. The next part of this particular lab is part 2, measuring the bolts and nut combination. BN stands for 1 bolt and 1 nut, and that is compound 1. That's what I have here. Compound 1 is 1 bolt and 1 nut. And I know that the bag weighs 0.765 grams because that's what's written in the bag. So if I weigh the combination of the bolt and the nut and the bag, the total mass that I read, in this particular case 14.7, is the combination of the bag, the nut, and the bolt together, 14.7 grams. To figure out the mass of just the bolt and the nut, I would take this 14.7 and subtract the mass of the bag, which is 0.765. The next step is to measure the mass of the bolt and 2 nuts combination. And that is what this particular item is. It's labeled BN2. Some of you might have it in a baggie, some of you might have it in this container. I have this container, and this container weighs 6.93 grams. So what I want to do is I want to weigh this particular combination, my scale. I'm going to tare my scale, which is nothing more than zeroing the scale, I want to place this particular item on the scale. It reads about 24.0 grams. I would write that on my lab journal, and then I would subtract from that 24 grams 6.93 grams. And the mass of the BN2 compound, compound number 2 in your data sheet, is going to be that difference. Do the same procedure for BN3, compound 3, and BN4, compound 4. What you will do again is tear your scale. Tear again just means nothing more than zero it. Recall that the holder is 6.915 grams as written on the container. Place the container and the chemical, the bolt nut chemical, on the scale. It reads 27.3 grams. I would take that 27.3, subtract the mass of the container, 6.915, and that would be my BN3 mass. Finally, I do it for the BN4 chemical. I would tear the scale again. I would read the mass of the container. I would weigh the combination, take the mass that I read from the scale, subtract the mass of the container, and that would be the mass of the BN4 chemical. The next step in this particular lab is to take your bean-rice combination. Now, the label should say 20 beans and 20 rice, and it should give you a mass on the bottom. The mass on the bottom is the mass of the container. So, what you will need to do is, again, tear your scale, make sure it's zero, place the bean, rice, and plastic bag on the scale. It reads 5.3 grams. I would subtract the mass of the container, and that would be the mass of the 20 bean-rice combination. Now, the question goes on to ask, well, what is the mass of one bean and one rice? Well, if the difference between the mass that you read and the mass of the container is the 20 bean-rice combination, then all you have to do is divide that number by 20 to get the mass of one bean-rice combination. The next step is to measure the mass of a marble. Now, to measure the mass of a marble, you would need these weighing boats. So, find a weighing boat in your lab kit. It looks like this. Put your scale on a flat surface. Place the weighing boat on that particular scale. It should register a mass. What you want to do is tear it, again, zero your scale so that it reads a 0. Take your marble, place it on the scale, make sure that the scale has settled down, and then read the mass of the marble. The next step in this procedure is to determine the mass of 50 milliliters of water. In order to do that, you would need to take a graduated cylinder. I'm going to remove the collar. I'm going to stick it on my digital scale. I will zero it out, tear it, and then I'm going to add 50 milliliters of water. And the amount of water that I add will register on the scale, and that'll be the mass of the 50 milliliters of water. So I'm just going to take a water bottle and add 50 milliliters of water. And water has a density of about 1.0 grams per milliliter. So the mass should be close to about 50 grams. as I approach 50 milliliters, I'm going to read the bottom of the meniscus of the water and make sure I have precisely 50 milliliters. The scale will read mass somewhere close to 50. It may not be 50 exactly. It might be 49.1, it might be 50.8, but it should be around 50. So that will be the mass of the water. You want to record that in your lab journal. We determine the mass of the sugar. The mass of the sugar will be, the sugar will be in a pouch, a baggy pouch. The mass of the container again will be written on that particular pouch. What you want to do is make sure that your scale is on. It automatically turns off if it's not in use. Tear your scale, zero it, add the sugar and the bag on the scale. It will register a mass. Write it in your lab journal. Subtract the mass of the container, and that'll be the mass of the sugar. Now done in terms of taking measurements of the different items you will need to do the calculation.